Kia ora koutou katoa. So, I'm very pleased to introduce James Shaw to you, who will speak to you shortly. James was a founding member of the Green Party in his teens. Just goes to show that there is no time that's too early to start encouraging people to get involved. He was a founding member in his teens, and he has spent his life since then, his working life, on sustainability here in Aotearoa and all over the world. We are enormously grateful and very privileged that he has been elected co-leader of the Greens to replace the amazing Russell Norman, who many of you know, and he signals a real future for the Green Party in Aotearoa. So please welcome to the stage James Shaw, co-leader of the New Zealand Greens.
Enga mana, enga reo, enga iwi o te motu. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. He mihi nui kia koutou. Kia ora. It was exactly 2 weeks ago that I finished my first speech as co-leader of the Green Party of Aotearoa, New Zealand. So I deliberately made that speech about climate change, about the need to build common cause on climate change, about how it's our responsibility as politicians to talk to each other rather than past each other, to come together and to take ambitious action on climate change. Because it's too important to do anything else. And this weekend has been pretty amazing for that. Bringing together people from around the Asia-Pacific region to share our experiences, our challenges, our opportunities, our ideas, our hopes, our ways of life, our ideas for transitioning our economies and building a sustainable future. So thank you so much for coming to New Zealand, for coming and sharing your stories and your inspiration, your passions. You are inspiring all of us to continue our work here and in each of our countries. Thank you for being green leaders. This has been a long journey for me. As Materia said, I first joined the Green Party in my last year of high school. I saw then that there were problems in the world: poverty, pollution, war, and I wanted to solve all of them, preferably before I turned 18 and started university. But I wasn't engaged back then specifically on the issue of climate change. The New Zealand Green Party was talking about what they called the greenhouse effect at the time. They were talking about carbon emissions, greenhouse gases, and global warming. But I never felt passionate about it. I never felt particularly connected to it. I was sort of more into whales and nuclear disarmament, it being the end of the 80s and the start of the 1990s. It wasn't until I was working overseas in London that I had a sort of a road to Damascus moment and realised the existential nature of the threat of climate change. I was working for PricewaterhouseCoopers. It's a global consultancy firm. I read a report about climate change by the insurance industry. So at the time, there was this kind of fake debate in politics and in the media between scientists and energy lobbyists who were pretending to be scientists. And all the politicians were saying, well, we're just not sure that this is happening. You know, the science doesn't seem to be settled on this, it's disputed. But some businesses had to take climate change seriously because their forecasts depended on scientific modelling and long-term forecasts, such as the insurance companies. So they rely on long-term, accurate actuarial forecasts. So the report that I read was about the long-term effects of climate change. It did some projections based on all the available data at the time, and it was all very calm and very rational, very methodical. And it concluded that the cumulative effect of extreme weather events and flooding caused by climate change, the catastrophic damage to property and the loss of lives over the next coming decades would bankrupt the entire global insurance industry by the year 2050. And I thought, why isn't anyone doing something about this? And my next thought was, why aren't I doing something about this? I'm an environmentalist. And so here I am. But it's an important question. Why isn't everyone terrified about climate change? Every government in the world is terrified that terrorists might attack their cities. No cost is too great to prevent that. But if we tell them that changes to the climate might create catastrophic damage to our cities and our economies, it's kind of like no big deal. As our friend the delegate from Malaysia said the other day, it's an illusion. It's not happening. The awful truth is, if you were a villain in a James Bond movie and you wanted to design a global threat that exploited all of our political, psychological, economic blind spots, you would invent climate change. Its cause is distributed across all of modern global civilization. But it's hard to link the cause with the effects. We're told that no one extreme weather event can be linked back to climate change. The kind of people who tell us that, of course, are the same kinds of people who used to tell us that there was no link between smoking and lung cancer. The best proof of climate change is that we have occasional footage of ice caps melting or charts showing atmospheric concentrations of CO2. And the people who profit from a carbon-dependent economy in the short term and who oppose any effort to do anything about it or to mitigate its effects are literally the wealthiest, most powerful people in the world. That's why everyday people have struggled to grasp the magnitude of the effect. It's why we had the fake scientific debate. The good news is that while all of these obstacles, the denial, the psychological blind spots, the entrenched opposition, we actually have won the argument, at least here in New Zealand. No one credible here denies that it's happening anymore. 5 years ago, prominent climate deniers were respected authorities in the media. Now, they're a joke. The bad news is that while we have won the argument, we haven't yet won any considerable policy changes. New Zealand has an emissions trading scheme, but it actually pays people to pollute. We have a commitment to an emissions reductions target, but we've yet to do anything significant about trying to actually reach that target, trying to actually hit that target. New Zealanders do care about climate change, but it's one of a number of issues that we're concerned about, along with healthcare, the economy, education, and all the day-to-day urgent stuff. I'm sure it's a familiar situation in many of your countries. New Zealanders get to vote every 3 years. That is the time when we can send a message about what it is that we care about. The problem is that climate change gets diluted along with all of the other issues. Whereas energy companies, whose profits are under threat from climate change policy, and it is the only issue that they particularly care about, get to talk to the government every single day with their wealth and their influence. So we don't get denial arguments anymore. We get excuses. The biggest excuse for inaction on climate change is this: we cannot afford to do anything about it. Our government recently got some independent economists to go out and to put together the total cost of reducing New Zealand's carbon emissions by 40% below 1990 levels by 2030. And what these economists found is that a 40% reduction in our emissions would reduce our gross domestic product growth in our gross domestic product by 0.1% per year. It's basically a rounding error. A lot of what the government does is about planning for disaster. So we have a military, we have civil defence, we have an earthquake fund, we are given security agencies with staggering powers and huge budgets to keep us safe from terrorists and bad guys. But all this money, all this keeping us safe, and the one disaster that we actually know is definitely going to happen, and we are doing absolutely nothing about it because we don't want to give up 0.1% of GDP. Maybe that's because here in New Zealand we are only a small part of the problem. And that is the other excuse. Because here in New Zealand we are actually only a small part of the problem. New Zealand accounts for 0.15% of global emissions. Most of the problem in our mind is elsewhere. It's in China, it's in the United States. But if we do something, it won't make the slightest bit of difference to what's going on globally. We will make this terrible sacrifice of 0.1% of GDP growth, and all we'll get for it is sustainable cities, better transport, healthier, happier people. But globally, emissions will only reduce by a very, very small amount. It won't make any difference. And that's true. We are a small part of the problem. And that's the real challenge of climate change. We are all a small part of the problem. Every city or region in China or the United States with a population about the same size as ours, 4 million people, can point to their own emissions and say, hey, we're only a small part of the problem. Why should we do anything about it? Imagine a situation where the United States says that they want to do something about climate change, but then Los Angeles, population 4 million, says, hey, we're only a small part of the problem. Why do anything about it? And if every other city and region says the same thing, no one does anything about it. New Zealand's guilty secret is that our emissions are greater per capita than just about everybody else's. We are 0.06% of the world's population, so we're tiny. But our emissions are 0.15% of global emissions. On a per capita basis, out of 189 countries, we're in the worst 17% for emitters. So the way to tackle climate change is for all of us to take responsibility for our share of the problem. The public has woken up to that, but our government has yet to do so. My challenge as Green Party co-leader is to convince New Zealanders that the Green Party need to be in government to respond to this crisis. It has to be us. It has to be the Greens. It's tempting to think that as things will get worse, other political parties will wake up and do something about it. Surely, eventually, they'll realise what's going on. They'll do something about it. But it's just not happening. We have been talking about doing something for more than 25 years, talking with no real action. We've had floods and droughts and record storms causing untold damage to our economy and to our country, and all we get is glib excuses. We have to manage the damage that is already being done. We have to stop it from getting worse. That is the only way. So our first task is to show the public what a government that has green leadership in it will look like. Because what we've heard up until now is that that is scary. We're told that the Greens are crazy, that will wreck the economy. The reality is that for most people, very little will change. What change there will be positive. We want to address child poverty. We want to address inequality. We want to tackle climate change. But the Green Party is about long-term thinking. It's about sustainability. It's about consensus building. Any changes that we make have to be measured and built to last. They have to survive political crises and changes of government. Green government is about smarter government, not necessarily bigger government or radical government. So let me give you an example. Parliament is there to write laws. Behind all the bickering and the posturing, that is actually what we do. And in New Zealand, when a minister introduces a new law into Parliament, the relevant ministries all write something called a regulatory impact statement, which take an objective look at what the new law will actually do. What will it really cost? What will be any unforeseen consequences? Who will be impacted and how? One of the reasons that we know that this government's recent deal with Sky City to build a convention centre in Auckland in exchange for a bigger casino is so terrible is because of the regulatory impact statement, which outlined all the social harm that the vast expansion in this casino would cause in terms of family violence, depression, bankruptcy, suicides, and so on. So these statements warn us about what new policies will actually do, not what politicians say that they'll do. Now, unfortunately, the Sky City deal is going to go ahead anyway, but there have been many instances where the reports from the regulatory impact statements shed light on the government's hidden agendas, and they have forced changes to new laws. It's a process that's invisible. It costs next to nothing. No one apart from public servants and politicians really know it's even there. But it saves us an incalculable amount of money and energy and time by creating political risk for politicians who want to pass terrible laws. It works just by being there. And it's a very important part of the way in which civil servants can provide honest advice about what new laws will do. What I want to see is a version of this process focused on climate change. This is the biggest problem in the world, so we should probably think about it when we're making new laws. That is why today the Green Party is launching a bill that will require every government bill to have a statement setting out how legislation will impact on climate change. When a government bill is introduced, it will come with a report prepared by the Ministry for the Environment, which will let us know what the implications are for our greenhouse gas emissions and our ability to meet our international greenhouse gas emissions reduction target. Put simply, if a new law causes pollution, the public gets to know. It will allow the opposition and the public to hold the government to account on climate issues. It will inform us, as politicians, about the impact that the legislation will have on the biggest challenge we face. Now, this government has introduced and passed legislation to make it easier to mine our fossil fuels and to subsidise the trucking industry, both of which have serious impacts on our emissions. So we know that that is going to cost us. But they didn't have to be upfront and tell us about what those costs would be. We don't know what the cost of their legislation is on our climate. So we need to change that. Now, a bill like this doesn't sound like much. I know that. Actually, that is the point. It's not going to change our society overnight. It's not going to wreck our economy. But by forcing every single new piece of legislation to acknowledge the reality and the costs of climate change, it will have a cumulative, gradual effect. It means that our Parliament is thinking about climate change, thinking about our climate all of the time. It will save us billions of dollars. It will save lives. And hey, if the only people who ever know about it are the public servants who have to institute it and a handful of outraged energy lobbyists, that's okay. This is the essence of green government. Smart, strategic policies that slowly but surely lead to transformational change. So I've only been in this job for a couple of weeks, and I'm still figuring things out. But one of the things that I think that political leaders are supposed to do is to show long-term leadership. In my first parliamentary session as co-leader, I offered to work with our Prime Minister, John Key, and his government to find common cause with us on climate change, to build policy certainty and stability for New Zealanders on the most important policy issue facing our government. Because climate change affects all of us and the things that we love. I think that politicians need to rise above the Punch and Judy show, to rise above the kind of routine that we so often engage in. If the G7 can commit to ditching fossil fuels, surely politicians in New Zealand can put aside our differences and our electoral interests for a good cause and find common ground. Because if we don't, we all lose. If we don't make a good enough plan, a future government will have to fix the mess. And that sentences New Zealand people and our businesses to decades of uncertainty and a climate policy that we cannot be proud of. We may not reach a perfect solution, but anything that we come up with now will be better than nothing, which is what we have now. Neither of us can lose. If we don't work together, then we all lose. New Zealand loses. Let's be leaders instead of followers. Let's find solutions and not excuses. Let's build a plan that we can all be proud of. Let's come together and find a way. Because if we don't, if we are divided, then we are lost. Nō reira, tēnā koutou katoa.